I want you to look at this boat up here. There are 8 people in that boat. When I see 8 people in a boat, all of them have equipment, I think, how do they get it done? I had trouble with a 2-person canoe. And I was in the front, which means I didn't have to steer. I just had to provide manpower. How do they handle 8 people working together? Well, that's the key. It's teamwork. It's coordinated work. Today, rowing is an Olympic sport for both men and women. It was first introduced in the 1700s. By the early 1800s, it had become an intercollegiate sport. And I don't know how familiar you are with the whole idea of rowing, but it's not as easy as it might look. It looks like a peaceful little stream out there, a little lake that they're on. But if they're working at it, it's not easy. For one rower, it takes strength, skill, and determination. You add a second rower, and it's got all that and more. Now there has to be coordination, cooperation, teamwork, harmony. You put 8 people in the boat, it takes even more. Now they have to listen to the directed timing of a captain who tells them when to row and how to do it. Now, rowing exists both as a sport and as a form of exercise, but boats with rudders and oars have been around since 3,000 years before the birth of Jesus. They've been around a long time. It is an ancient skill. Long before there was nuclear power or steam or turbine engines, back when there was only the wind, rowing was the backup plan when there was no wind. The ancient Greeks and the Romans traveled in huge rowboats. They were called galleys. And they had long rows of oars, sometimes 3 levels of rowers on top of each other, sitting above each other and below each other. And the slaves that were sitting and chained at the bottom of the boat were called under rowers. Under rowers. Now, why is it I wanted you to know about ancient under rowers? For this reason. In our day of famous, world-famous clergymen and televangelists, I think it's easy to lose sight of what it really means to be a servant of God. You can be famous. You can be caught up in the fame. You can become prideful. And you can forget what it means to be a servant. Paul, if he were existed today, I think people would want to put him on a pedestal. But you know where he put himself? In the bottom of the boat. I want you to look at what he wrote to the Corinthian church. It was a startling statement to them. In 1 Corinthians 4, verse 1, he said, "So then men ought to regard us as servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the secret things of God." The phrase I want you to see is servants of Christ. Now, Paul could have chosen any number of words that we would translate today as servant, but guess which word he chose here? It's the word servants, hypokrites, under rowers. That's the word he chose. He says that people should regard me as an under rower. That's what I want you to think about when you think of me. Not as the top man on the totem pole, not as the head leader, not as the one who has the final say. Under rower. Under rower. Now, why would he use this word to these people? Well, there's probably no other city where this word could have had as great an impact as it would in Corinth. I want you to look at this map of the ancient Mediterranean. Italy is on the left, and on Asia Minor is on the right. And you'll notice right in the middle is Greece, ancient Greece. If you do a close-up map of ancient Greece, it shows the Achaia Peninsula at the bottom. And there is a very small 4-mile-wide land bridge that connects the southern peninsula to the mainland. You know where the city of Corinth was? Right on that land bridge. That's why it was so cosmopolitan. All north and south traffic had to go right through Corinth. And guess what? They wouldn't even sail the boats around the dangerous peninsula. They would drag them across the 4-mile land bridge from east to west. And a common sight would be the tramway, the ship tramway, moving the ships from one side to the other, especially the triremes, the 3-level galley ships. And so the term under-rower was a term that everyone in Corinth knew very well. And I think it was deliberately chosen by Paul. And not just because it was familiar to the city. I think he chose it because this church at Corinth, torn by disharmony and disunity, needed to hear his lesson. I want you to take your worship bulletin and turn to the middle, if you would. And I want us to look first at the picture of disharmony that exists in this church that he writes to. If we just step back away from the Corinthian letter and look at all of it, you can easily see some serious internal problems. Here's some things you might want to write down. In chapters 1 through 4, there's a discussion about general disunity that exists there. It shows itself by them picking their favorite ministers. What I mean is some of them said, well, my favorite minister is Paul. Another one says, no, the best one is Apollos. And one says, no, both of you are wrong. It's got to be Peter. I mean, he's the best one of all. He was the closest one to Jesus. And there's all these groups beginning to form. General division. In chapter 5, there were families in this church living in incest. Paul uses the Greek word porneia. We get our word pornography from it. And the fact is, the city of Corinth was famous for this. If you called someone a Corinthian, you're acting like a Corinthian. That's just saying you're acting immoral. That was in this church. In chapter 6, there were lawsuits and even more immorality. Now, Paul calls some of the problems, his language was simple disputes. He calls them trivial cases. But that's what he thought of them. But you know what they thought of them? Well, they wouldn't even sit down and talk them through. They wouldn't extend love to each other. No, they were taking each other to court in this church over things Paul said were trivial. In chapter 7, several marriages were in conflict. And so Paul writes to try to help them out. He's very sensitive and very direct. He writes to the mixed marriage, where one is a Christian and one is not. But he also writes to the widow, he writes to the unmarried, and he writes to the Christian who has been abandoned by their spouse. In chapter 8, we find that some are practicing idolatry in this church. That makes sense because many had just come out of idolatry when they became Christians. And some were confused about what they had to let go of and how much of it they needed to let go of. And so Paul writes to them in chapter 8. And then chapters 11 through 14, several were confused about worship in this church. And they were in conflict with each other. In fact, rather than using their spiritual gifts to serve each other, they were using them to show off. It was like watching a bunch of children showing off who has the best toy. And Paul talks to them like they're children. And in the middle of it all, the worship of God, well, it just got lost as they all showed off their toys. And so at the end, it's sad, but it's not surprising that in chapter 15, there were some that even denied the resurrection of Jesus, which Paul says voids everything. In fact, in that chapter, he says, if there is no resurrection, why is anyone even baptized? He says, let's just eat and drink because tomorrow we die. It's all over. There's nothing else if there is no resurrection. And in view of all this disharmony, if you just step back and look at the whole letter and all the disharmony that's in this letter, it's interesting then to go and read that famous chapter on love, chapter 13, because it becomes very clear Paul is not just writing a simple love poem. No, he is applying love to all of these problem areas in this church. In fact, Paul's words in that chapter fit perfectly because these people were envious and boastful, and they were proud and rude, and they were self-seeking and easily angered, all which he said love is not. And so it's not surprising that their worst enemy is division and conflict, and all the attitudes that follow: pride, quarreling, slander, arrogance, all the things that follow it. And so I want us to see, secondly, Paul's descriptions of the source of this disharmony. We've kind of looked at it in a broad way, the whole letter, but I want you to look at three particular sources of disharmony. One, they began, as I mentioned earlier, to form factions inside this church. Chapter 1, verse 11. He says, "My brothers, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you." What I mean is this: one of you says, "I follow Paul." Another, "I follow Apollos." Another, "I follow Cephas." Still another, "I follow Christ." We got 4 groups forming in this church. Factions. Secondly, they begin to act like what I call adult children. Now, they're adults. They're legal age, but they're acting like children. He says in chapter 3, "Brothers, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly, mere infants in Christ. In fact, I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not yet ready for it. Indeed, you're still not ready. You are still worldly. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere men? For when one says, 'I follow Paul,' and another, 'I follow Apollos,' are you not mere men? You're acting like children," he said. And then finally, their attitudes, all these attitudes brought conflict and division. Just one simple phrase describes it in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 18. He says, "Some of you have become arrogant." You've become arrogant. That's what's happening in your life. And so there's disharmony. It's easy for those with one viewpoint to get together and talk about how wrong everybody has another viewpoint. And that's what's happening in this church. And you know what? It's still easy to do it. It's very easy to do it. For those of us who have different opinions about different things, to get together and talk about all the other ones who have the wrong view on this thing. And does it help anyone? Well, let's read about this church. It doesn't help anyone. I saw an interesting cartoon the other day. It was a drawing of 6 small church buildings side by side, right next to each other. And there was an angry head leaning out both sides of each building. And they were hollering at the church building next to them. And to the right, they were leaning out. This head said, "Conservative." And to the left, someone was leaning out saying, "Liberal." And guess what? They were all right. They were all correct. Because everybody to my right, my left is conservative and liberal. Compared to some people, I'm conservative. Compared to other people, I'm liberal. But you know what else I am? If I stick my head out and I buy into that, I'm distracted. I'm not getting my work done. I'm off course. I'm ineffective. As soon as I take up the mission of strife and conflict and fault finding, I abandon the mission of God. That's what they were doing. The Corinthians needed to see a very different picture. They needed to see the opposite of disharmony. They needed to see a picture of harmony. And so look with me at the picture of harmony. What was it that Paul gave them? What did he tell them? What do they need to know about harmony? Well, he goes to this beautiful chapter right in the middle of the book, chapter 13, and he tells them 4 things that they need to know. They needed to know first what love is. And he tells them it's patient and it's kind. How does that hit people in conflict? Love is patient. Love is kind. Are you a patient person? Are you kind? Or are you irritable? Am I taking too long? They needed to know what love is. Secondly, they needed to know what love is not. And it's not proud. It's not rude. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. Wow. If I had those things, how many conflicts would be resolved or never found? If I was not rude, not proud, not self-seeking, not easily angered. Wow. They needed to know what love is not. They also needed to know what love would do. And he says, well, love rejoices with the truth. And look at what it does. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always perseveres. Now, can you be in conflict with somebody that you're always protecting them and always hoping for them and always persevering with them and always trusting them? Conflict would be kind of difficult, wouldn't it? How would unity be? Wow, it'd be a snap. And he wants them also to know what love would not do. He said, well, it doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. And look at this. It keeps no record of wrongs. It doesn't delight in evil. I know people that not only keep a record of wrong, but the reason they keep a record of wrong is so they can read it and delight in the evil in it. Oh, wait till I tell you what he did to me yesterday. And you think that's bad? Last year, well, I wrote them all down. Let me show you. And there's almost delight in the record I've kept. But it doesn't do that, he said. And see, this church at Corinth needs to hear this. Because of Roman numeral 1 that I told you. All those conflicts, all that strife. Now, here's something else. We might expect that when Paul writes to a church that he planted, that he might call upon his own authority, appeal to his own authority as the founder. We might expect him to throw a little apostolic weight around, just a little bit. But he doesn't do any of it. In fact, he says, I want you to think of me as an under-rower. The bottom of the ship. The very bottom. Not the leader on the pedestal. Start the music, I'm coming in. Dun, dun, ta, dun. No. I'm not your commander-in-chief. I'm your under-rower. That's what I want you to think about me. Why? Well, see, they don't need yet another picture of an arrogant leader. They need a picture of a humble leader. They need an example of harmony. And so he says in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 1, read it with me again. So then men ought to regard us as servants of Christ. Servants, under-rowers for Jesus. Now, notice he says us. What's he doing there? He's tearing apart their factions. He's saying, I've talked to Cephas, and I've talked to Apollos, and I've talked to myself. We don't want to be on your pedestals. We all want to be under-rowers. That's where we are. We're going to take that distraction away from you. You know, the under-rower's life at the bottom of the ship was difficult, it was busy, and it was permanent. Most of them died there. Is this the way you see your faith? Permanent? Busy? For life? From here on? Put yourself at the bottom of the ship for a minute. See yourself as an under-rower. And with Paul as our example, I want to ask the question, what does it mean to live in a church as an under-rower? My precedent is Paul. If he can say, that's the way I want you to think about me, then what would happen if we all said, hey, I want everyone here to think about me as an under-rower? What would that mean if we were all under-rowers? I think here's what it would mean. First of all, the under-rowers follow the captain's beat. He sets the tone. He sets the rhythm. Now, this is a little different, granted, from the true galley ship. The true galley ship, their life was a torment. It was harsh. It was cruel. But our captain is not driving us to an early death. No, his pace, his tempo fits who we are. It fits what we need. It fits what we can do. He knows what I can do. And his tempo and his schedule fits me. And so if we join Paul as under-rowers, we are choosing to follow the rhythm of Jesus. And that's a whole study in and of itself. What is the rhythm of Jesus? It completely changed Paul's rhythm as the driven, murderous Christian hunter to the one who's writing this letter, saying, I forgive you. Learn to love each other. Secondly, under-rowers pulled together. They had to. There were 30-foot oars, and they had 2 or 3 people on each oar. They couldn't pull and push at the same time. There had to be harmony. They had to operate as a team. And so if we join Paul as under-rowers, we are choosing to pull together, to work together, to walk together, to minister together. And the only way to do that is to talk together and to get along together. Thirdly, under-rowers trusted the captain. Now, of course, the galley slaves, well, they didn't have any choice. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know when they would arrive. They didn't know anything because no one cared about them. They just listened to the drum and they felt the lash of the whip. And I don't even know that we could call what they felt trust. But in our case, we can choose easily to trust our captain. We don't have to be uncertain about our destiny, even though we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. That does not undermine my certainty about my destiny, because my captain said, don't worry about tomorrow. Let him worry about it. We can trust him. Fourthly, the under-rowers were committed for life. It was a one-way trip. There were no transfers. No one retired. The slave would die in service, usually through disease or an accident or cruelty, execution. If the ship was attacked by some enemy or if it went down in a storm, they went down with it. That was theirs. We have a little different life commitment. We're committed for life, but God has touched us and God has healed us. And we can go wherever, whenever, however we want to. And we can even go down with the ship because He's promised to raise us up. The Corinthians needed to hear this. Some of them didn't buy resurrection. And so if you, as someone did at the first service, decide to become a Christian today, if you make the decision to be baptized into Jesus, you need to know that it is for life. It's forever. And finally, fifthly, the under-rowers served in humility. You know, the galley slave was like a machine buried deep inside this ship. Never seen, certainly never honored. If he was seen, it was usually because he was not doing his job, and he's called up to be punished. But when we choose to serve as under-rowers, we also work in humility, but not in humiliation. In fact, what's interesting is our captain has chosen to take our humiliation for us. How would that change a slave galley ship? If the captain left his drum, went down, and took everybody's punishment for them. That is what has happened. Would that change the feeling and the tempo and the tenor and the emotion of the under-rower? I think so. He took our humiliation upon himself. And so we choose to work as servants following his example. Now, I'll admit to you, I don't know that Paul had all of this in mind when he wrote to the Corinthians. But I do know that out of the more than 70 times he wrote in his letters about being a servant, this is the only time he uses this word. He picked it for them. And he lays the under-rower before the city that sees the ships. He lays the under-rower before the church that needs a message of service. And he says it's a picture of himself and a picture of his co-workers. See what he's doing? He's needing to write a letter to chastise them, but before he does it, he says, you need to know who I am. I'm your under-rower. I'm your servant. And on that basis, I need to chastise you. And he writes the letter. When I thought about living this message, I thought about 4 questions that I think we need to hear now and later. I want you to ask yourself, first of all, are you rowing to the beat of Jesus, or are you following your own rhythm? Which is it? Now, I know that we're taught from birth to do your own thing, and that's great. Find your own way. This is not a denial of your own gifts and talents. No, we could admit right up front that they were all given to you by God. This is asking, have you submitted your gifts and talents to the rhythm of Jesus, to the purpose of Jesus, to the schedule of Jesus? Have you given them to Him? And by the way, it's not something you're going to accomplish today. You may begin it today, as one young man did at the first service. He began it. But it's going to be something that's going to take your whole life to be molded and shaped. And it's going to be both a joy and a struggle. I've said many times, anything valuable is expensive. It's going to cost you to be shaped by God. Secondly, are you willing to go wherever He leads, or only where it feels comfortable? Wherever He leads. What if He takes you, what if He takes all of us into new territory with a new thought, a new experience? We meet a new person, a new ministry. How do you take newness? Do you see it as an opportunity, or do you see it as a threat? Do you say to God, you know, this is kind of new to me. I've really never done it this way before, and so I'm just going to pass, okay? Do we say that? Or do we say to God, I will go wherever you lead me. Wherever you lead me. Thirdly, are you pulling together with your fellow Christians, or are you isolated and thereby judgmental? I guess what I'm asking is, are you a team player? Or do you say things like, well, I don't really want to get involved. I'll just watch from a distance. Let me tell you, the further away you go, the more distance there is, the less you see clearly what's really going on. And let me ask you, how accurate is the critic who's far away? Not very accurate. But on the other hand, if you're in the grind, if you're in the mix, if you're in the trenches with everybody else working right alongside of them, guess what? You won't have time to complain. Now, you're going to be busy. You're going to be working. You're going to be involved. And not only that, what you might have complained about over on the sidelines, now you see much clearer. Now you may see exactly why it's being done this way. And now that you're involved, even your criticism will be informed. And it will be helpful. It'll be constructive. And people will take it from you because you're working right with them. And when you say, there's another way to do this, they're going to say, hey, tell me. I'll take anything from you. You're right here with me. You're not the sideline critic. You're involved, pulling together. Are you pulling together with everyone else, or are you just blazing your own trail? And then fourthly, are you committed for life or just until it becomes difficult? I know that some people don't even like the idea of being an under rower. But let me tell you this. The fact is, everybody is rowing on somebody's ship. You're on somebody's ship. And so the question is, whose ship are you on? Do you know where it's going? Do you know what its purpose is? Do you know who it's serving, what its mission is? There's a lot of people in this church. And if we were to go along with our metaphor, we could say there's a lot of people in this boat. And we're all in the same boat. And more than ever, we now need to pull together. Jesus is our master pilot. We get our directions from Him. But He has given our shepherds, the shepherds of this church, the task and the authority to determine our direction here in this city. And we need to follow them and trust them and support them and thank them. They're volunteers. And they're tired. The next few weeks is going to bring a lot of change to this church. We're not going to change our doctrine. We're not going to change our beliefs. But we are going to change our schedule. Sometimes people can have a little easier time with the belief than the schedule. Can you figure that out? And so what I'm going to ask you to do right now is look at the title of this sermon and just decide, we are going to pull together. I am going to pull together. Our shepherds have announced where we're headed, and we are going to support them. And I'm going to expect wonderful serendipities that I never would have thought about that's going to come out of this, because I'm not going to be sitting where I always sit. And when they say, let's stand up and greet someone you don't know, I'm actually going to find someone I don't know, because 2 services are going to be in one room. So let's just decide to pull together. Let's decide with Paul, I'm going to be an under-rower, a servant, not blazing my trail, but following my leaders. Let's bow together. Father, I thank you that the most powerful example of being a servant we see is your Son Jesus. Giving up heaven, emptying himself, becoming a servant, becoming a slave of servants, dying the death of a servant. And Father, I pray that if we wear his name, we will follow in his style. Thank you, Father, that you changed the heart and life of Paul from Saul, the independent destroyer, to Paul, the humble follower of Jesus. That encourages me, Father, that you can change my heart as well. And so work in us this next 2 months. Show us wonderful things as we work together and pull together. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.